correct term. There's differences of opinion in Tehran as to how they should deal with President Trump. There's obviously enormous mistrust of President Trump because on two occasions while the US and Iran were negotiating, President Trump launched military action. So some fear that this is all a ruse and he plans to attack again. Those same folks argue that when you're dealing with a bully, you can never give in as a result of their pressure because that will only embolden President Trump to turn on the heat on Iran. But others, especially those who are in charge of managing Iran's national budget, say, listen, we have to make a compromise. We have to prepare the country for compromise. And all these groups are committed to the revolution, committed to the system. They have differences of opinion about how they should negotiate.
And Margaret, you heard Caroline Levitt saying because the ships that the Iranians claim to have seized were not U.S. or Israeli, the president doesn't see it as a ceasefire violation. Does that make sense?
No, it does not. So a blockade in and of itself is actually an act of war. So even just the imposition of a blockade is technically ending or circumventing the ceasefire. Now, the Iranian blockade has been illegal from the start, whether or not they were at war, because they're blockading international waters, which can never be the case in a blockade. The U.S., by contrast, is simply blockading the Iranian ports. But in terms of seizing and boarding these third country vessels, that's basically the entire point of the blockade. So no, I don't think that. I think it does constitute a violation of the ceasefire. That is the goal of the blockade, is to stop third country vessels from breaching it, and that seems to be what Iran is doing. And I think if you ask Greece whether or not it was a violation of the ceasefire, I think they hold a different opinion.
And Alan, what's President Trump signaling to the Iranians when he says, as he did on Fox, that there's no time pressure on the ceasefire extension?
Well, he says that, but then his people leak to Axios and other things. It's a 3 to 5 day extension. So I think he wants to have his cake and eat it too. On the one hand, he needs to give space to negotiations because he doesn't want to go back to military strikes. But on the other hand, he can't totally relinquish what he feels is control, and he wants to keep pressure on Iran. So that's why that happened the way it did.
And Alan, based on your experience in these negotiations, the president constantly, or repeatedly, I should say, threatening civilizational destruction or destruction of all the bridges, dual-use infrastructure, all of which he has threatened at various times, and then threatening, a deadline on a ceasefire, and then continually extending the ceasefire, which one may say makes sense for valid negotiation reasons. But what sort of a message do you think the Iranians, and how do the Iranians, you think, interpret all that?
Well, I think they're probably confused because, not necessarily publicly, but the message even passed through the Pakistanis continues to change, and that makes the response hard. In terms of President Trump's public statements, I think they've probably learned, like the rest of us, not to pay too much attention to them because he's either trying to scare the Iranians into capitulation or assuage the markets so all the indices don't go in the wrong direction.
Kareem, we talked about the Navy Secretary stepping down or being removed. It apparently has nothing to do with the execution of the war because it's largely it's not an operational role. It certainly could be used by the Iranians as a sign, or interpreted by the Iranians as